It's lasted nearly 11 years and claimed the lives of some 2,000 Americans. So why are President Obama and Mitt Romney not talking about America's war in Afghanistan? You're watching Inside Story US 2012 from Washington. Hello, I'm Shihab Ratansi. President Obama inherited the US's entanglement in Afghanistan from George W. Bush, but he embraced the mission wholeheartedly, calling it a just war. 27 months ago, he launched what became known as the Surge, a further 30,000 US troops entering the conflict. It was a tactic that some analysts judged to have been a dismal failure, with some 1,000 American troops losing their lives, about the same as the previous 8 years of war. In addition to an unknown number of Taliban and other insurgent casualties, it's estimated over 10,000 Afghan troops have lost their lives, with at least another 10,000 civilian deaths since the war commenced in 2001. In May of this year, President Obama and Afghanistan's President Karzai signed an agreement that was short on specifics, but the aim is to hand combat responsibility to Afghan troops by the end of 2014, while giving the US the option to keep troops in the country for many years to come. There is little sign the Taliban is close to being defeated, and the handover plan has been complicated by a rise in so-called green-on-blue attacks by Afghan soldiers on American and other NATO soldiers. The latest came on Monday morning when 2 US soldiers were killed after an Afghan opened fire in the province of Laghman. With the presidential campaign in full swing, neither party seems to want to discuss the war, though. Mitt Romney in particular seems vague on what he'd do differently from President Obama. Al Jazeera's Rosalind Jordan has been looking at the state of America's Afghan war.
U.S. President Barack Obama has called the 11-year-long war in Afghanistan the just war, fought to overthrow the Taliban-led government and defeat al-Qaeda. The Taliban is out of power, but the military says it and al-Qaeda will still be threatening Afghanistan's stability come January 1st, 2015, the first day Afghan forces take charge.
Lots of challenge still. Challenge in the installation of governance, challenge in the embracing of the rule of law, challenge in rooting out corruption.
The more immediate challenge, a dramatic increase in numbers of Afghan troops shooting U.S. and coalition forces, or so-called green-on-blue attacks. 22 U.S. soldiers have been killed by their Afghan allies this year. Officials cannot definitively say why. Publicly, the Obama administration has been delivering a message of solidarity with Afghan officials, but they also admit the country won't be at peace, even after the bulk of U.S. forces leaves. What's more, the administration has failed to make the case for continued engagement with the American people. A recent poll found 60% of Americans said the U.S. should not be involved in Afghanistan, while 31% said the U.S. was doing the right thing by continuing the fight. Obama announced the pullout of U.S. troops before the killing of Osama bin Laden. Since then, there's been no public pressure on the president to explain why U.S. troops are still in Afghanistan. Analysts say that could change if the number of green-on-blue attacks keeps rising.
There's this idea that the U.S. and its allies are going to transition from fighting the Taliban ourselves to partnering with the Afghans to fight the Taliban. And of course, that strategy is thrown into question if you can't trust the very Afghans you're partnered with.
While U.S. officials try to figure out what the post-2014 presence will look like, they have to prepare the public for a mission where some Americans' lives will still be at risk. Rosalind Jordan, Al Jazeera, Washington.
So, why isn't the war in Afghanistan a major election issue? To discuss this, I'm joined by Lawrence Wilkerson, who served as Chief of Staff for Colin Powell when he was Secretary of State. He also served in the US Army for over 30 years. Kurt Volker served as US Ambassador to NATO in both the George W. Bush and Obama administrations. Also with us, Rajiv Chandrasekaran, a senior correspondent and associate editor at the Washington Post. His book, Little America, The War Within the War for Afghanistan, was published this summer. Colonel Wilkerson, first of all, then, is there a case to be made that this topic, the Afghan war and the escalation, in terms of human life and resources, was perhaps the biggest mistake of President Obama's first term?
Given the financial and economic crisis that I think still confronts us and will confront us for some time to come? No. But it comes in second, I think. There is no light at the end of the tunnel. There's so much similarity to my war, Vietnam, illegitimate government, sanctuary, enemy fighting a total war, you're fighting a limited war. I don't see how we get out of this with anything other than more casualties and nothing even remotely resembling a victory.
And what's so interesting about that, Rajiv, is that he was quite explicit on the campaign trail, Obama. This is a war we must win, and this is a campaign promise that surely can be exploited now in the context of an election campaign.
Well, look, Obama can say he did what he promised. He always called Afghanistan the good war, in contrast to Iraq, which for him was the bad war. But in the campaign in 2008, he didn't really give Afghanistan all that much thought. And he thought that the cost of succeeding in Afghanistan was going to be relatively small, 1 or 2 more combat brigades. It wasn't until he took office, the military told him, look, actually, the price for doing what we think needs to be done is much, much higher. And we can argue whether the military is realistic or not, and I tend to agree with Larry that the strategy just did not comport with the reality on the ground there. But Obama bought into it. And so he can at least say, look, I did what was promised, but on the bigger issue, did what he approved work? That's certainly not the case.
How can you say he did what was promised when he said we must win this, and clearly he hasn't won this? Wouldn't that be a point of weakness?
Well, yeah, but it all depends on how you sort of define victory, and we're defining it down. And I think what he's going to do is focus on the very narrow mission to target Osama bin Laden, and that's certainly a big point in his favor. And he can say, look, Afghanistan, though it is very violent, chaotic, messy today, the central government is able to hold Kabul and other major cities. The Afghan army is starting to show marginally better performance. It's not like the Taliban have taken over large swaths of the country. Yes, they do have enclaves, perhaps growing ones, but it's not like they're ready to sweep into the capital like they did in the mid-90s. So he can at least say, look, we've arrested the growth of the Taliban. But it's going to be hard for him to say that anything that's been done there has been, going to give us conventional notions of victory.
Well, before we get into what the strategy is precisely now, Ambassador, what do we hear from Mitt Romney and Paul Ryan then about the Afghan war? As far as what
well, you hear very little. You hear very little, and I would agree with some of what Rajiv has just said. Although I would put a different spin on it. I think Obama did believe that he wanted to win Afghanistan, and I do think that getting into that and making a commitment of troops was more than he wanted to do. He also wanted to get out, and so you saw this bifurcated stance of putting in the resources and giving a deadline for taking them out, having to move that from 2011 to 2014, but then setting another deadline and doing it again. So it was never an articulated strategy for here's what we're going to achieve. It's rather a strategy for how we're going to get out. Having done that for the last 3 years, I think the American people are quite understandably tired, frustrated, and also very concerned about our own domestic situation. So they're not sure that they want to see any more in Afghanistan. People are still dying there, but without any objectives, why? In that circumstance, I don't think it's going to pay any political benefits for Mitt Romney to go in and say, well, I disagree. I think we need to still be in Afghanistan, commit more, dedicate more, even though he may disagree, and I don't know, he hasn't spoken about it, but even though he may disagree with how Obama has approached it up to this point, he now faces a political situation where this may not be salvageable.
Recent opinion polling shows that now a narrow majority of Republicans even believe this war is not worth fighting. So for Romney to make that argument that Obama should have done more, he shouldn't have put a deadline on the troop surge, that we should bring the troops home more slowly than perhaps right. Obama would if he were elected to a second term, that's not even going to play well with the Republican base. And part of that is also driven by the costs of this war. Last year we spent $100 billion to fight the war. And the Tea Party faction of the Republican Party has grown increasingly concerned about the outlays for the war.
But Romney is quite outspoken in saying the Pentagon should get pretty much anything they want. Though.
Oh, yes, yeah, 4% of GDP. Right. And that's going to be an interesting conflict that will shape up among the Republican Party between the budget cutters, even Paul Ryan, and the president, should Romney get elected.
Colonel, though, as things stand now, though, does President Obama and this administration have a clear objective that it's offering the American electorate as we go into this?
I think so.
Election?
Get out.
Is it as simple as that?
I think it really is. I
Even
think it
though
is.
that-
And if they turn to something that we have become deliberately bad at of late, diplomacy, they may be able to salvage
But
something.
what about the continuation of a
answer-
counterterrorism policy?
Well, the
and
answer
all
to
that?
that, too, is Turkey and India and Pakistan and Iran and other countries in the region who have to live with what's in Afghanistan for the foreseeable future. Geography's not going to change. And we've done so little in that regard that I can detect to get these people involved, particularly Iran. We are now using Iran, I'm told, and my sources are fairly reliable, I think, in a way that's positive with regard to Syria. My God, we should be using them in the same way with regard to Afghanistan. It's in their interest to have a stable Afghanistan.
But the argument there was always such a hostility towards Iran in the State Department and elsewhere that even though they are natural allies in the fight against Al-Qaeda and on a host of other topics like Afghanistan, it was impossible. You think that's changed? Then?
Well,
you think there's some...
I can only judge by the State Department that I was privy to, and a lot of the people are still there. There was no more hostility towards Iran in NEA or throughout the State Department than there was towards other countries like North Korea. So, I mean, diplomacy is diplomacy. You deal with your enemies through diplomacy more forthrightly, more strenuously, more intently than you do with your friends.
But Rajiv, though, as far as we know, this term transitioning, what does it mean as far as a time frame, as far as money is concerned, in the foreseeable future? And of course, you know, the agreement reached with Hamid Karzai does suggest the possibility of a U.S. presence for many years to come.
Oh, most certainly. Getting out doesn't mean getting everybody out. What the NATO allies have agreed to is the end of a conventional combat force mission there at the end of 2014. Both the Obama administration and one can certainly expect if Romney is elected, will seek to keep troops on the ground post-2014 for two principal functions. One is to continue to train and mentor the Afghan security forces, and the second is to conduct counterterrorism operations, both in Afghanistan and, if need be, in countries in the neighborhood. And so I don't think we should be under any illusions that everybody's going home.
But how many people will remain, and how much money is this going to cost?
Well, that's going to be a big question. Remember, with regard to Iraq, the Pentagon wanted to keep a certain number there. The White House wanted a smaller number. Ultimately, the Iraqis said no, or at least the Iraqis put in conditions that then the White House judged to be untenable. With the case of Afghanistan, it's going to be very different because the Afghan government is going to rely on U.S. and NATO support for its government and for its security forces. It doesn't have the oil revenue that Iraq has. And here's, I believe, one very significant consequence of the conspiracy of silence between Obama and Romney on the war. Regardless of who wins this November, the United States is going to have to continue shelling out several $billions a year to help sustain the Afghan army that we have created, to help pay for functions of the Afghan government, to provide humanitarian aid to the Afghan people. That requires political consensus. And you're not going to get that, particularly in a time of economic crisis, unless you're making a case to the American people. It's going to be much harder as those American troops come home in 2013 and 14 to convince Congress that they need to appropriate $3-4 billion a year. We're talking potentially in 2015 and 16 more money per year for Afghanistan than we give to Israel.
If we go back to how the decision was made, though, to have the surge in Afghanistan, Ambassador, again, this seems like a pertinent moment to analyze as we look at whether President Obama deserves a second term. Many of the criticisms that you raised about the strategy were raised actually at that time. I think Colonel Wilkerson,
right.
we might have had a number of interviews actually around that time. I think I had an interview with Mike Mullen at the time, where we basically said pretty much all the same criticisms that you just repeated. What does it tell us about his leadership, his decision making then, that all of those problems came to pass?
You know, I don't think that Americans are going to vote on Afghanistan. One way, so it's not going to be.
But as we look at the man, as we look at the president, as we look at the leadership, what does this tell us then?
Well, I think that we need strong leadership and commitment to what we're trying to do, and I don't think we've seen that for the past 3 years. I think that giving the Taliban a signal as to what the deadline is, not providing the resources that we said we would do to implement a given strategy. If you're going to take a strategy, you've got to be in it to win. And I don't think we did that either.
Because that's assuming any military strategy was going to work, right?
That's right. Well, and I think that, and I disagree with Larry a little bit on the diplomacy side, because I think in order for diplomacy to be successful, you have to have a force and strategy behind that from which to negotiate. You have to negotiate from a position of strength. Right now, there is a lot of diplomacy going on. Ambassador Mark Grossman is trying to lead a negotiation with the Taliban Taliban.
They'll mark well in the...
Yeah, but the Taliban is feeling quite comfortable. They know we're leaving anyway.
But do you buy that, Colonel Wilkerson, that there was a military solution here?
No, I don't. There was no military solution in Afghanistan except the one I suggested to Secretary Powell in 2002, and that was bash the hell out of al-Qaeda and get out. And if they came back, go back and bash them again until they got the word and move somewhere else, which they inevitably would do.
Let me connect these 2 points because I think they're both essential. Diplomacy is a key part of getting out, but President Obama's management of this war. As I write in my book, we squandered the first year of the troop surge because the White House was in open warfare with the State Department. Richard Holbrooke, who was the predecessor to Mark Grossman as the special representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan, we could argue he was a flawed figure. People either loved him or hated him. He was in charge of forging a path toward possible negotiations with the Taliban. Senior officials in Obama's White House couldn't stand him. They worked to undercut him. There was terrible disunity at senior levels of this administration. The president knew about it. The president could have stopped it. He could have either said, Richard Holbrooke, you need to leave, and taken the political hit with Secretary of State Clinton, or he could have told his national security staff, cut it out, follow Richard Holbrooke. He didn't do that. And so when you look at, for instance, the diplomacy around this, or you look at some of the other decisions on where troops were sent, even if you accept the fact that the strategy was the strategy, there really is a case to be made about the president's management of this war.
His team of rivals. As we
yes, and the consequence of that.
I agree with that, and I agree with Kurt also that there has been a lack of leadership. But let's look at it. I mean, where did he come from? He came from the Senate. He came from how much experience? He comes into the White House and he's captured by the DCI, the DNI now. He's captured by the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of the Treasury. The president has a decision-making calculus determined by those around him in the bureaucracy.
What about the military then, Rajiv? You've written a great deal about this. Is it fair to characterize this as simply him being bullied by military leaders to go down a particular route?
I think that's oversimplifying it. Certainly the military believed that the counterinsurgency strategy that worked in Iraq would also work in Afghanistan and that more troops were essential. They believed that the government of President Hamid Karzai would be a loyal ally, which it certainly has not been. They believed that with enough pressure, Pakistan would crank down on Taliban sanctuaries. That really hasn't happened. But Obama had a lot of other smart advice. He had clearly strident dissenting points of view, most notably Vice President Biden and other civilian staff in the White House. So this wasn't a case of Obama not having any other options. But remember, first-term young Democratic president, no previous national security expertise, campaigning on Afghanistan being the good war. It would have been a politically challenging decision for him to have said no at that time.
Let's remind us specifically what he did decide upon in December of 2009. It was to pursue a military strategy that would break the Taliban's momentum, he said, including that much-discussed surge of 30,000 troops. It was to pursue a more effective civilian strategy, including cracking down on ineffective or corrupt Afghan government agencies, and to have that robust partnership with Pakistan built on mutual respect and trust. I mean, to go through those points individually.
And it was a strategy very vigorously, aggressively even, and persuasively, as only David can be, put forward by David Petraeus.
Right.
Yes.
I mean, but what was so odd about that, even from the outset, as many people pointed out, there's 30,000 troops. I guess they wanted 40,000 at the Pentagon, it said. But it doesn't even fit with General Petraeus' own field manual on counterinsurgency of a ratio of 1 to 50, one U.S. service personnel member to 50 civilians. I mean, that would mean 600,000 troops. I mean, on every aspect of Petraeus' own coin strategy, it didn't make any sense.
And
yet, how
I think
was that
there's a factor
upon?
here that you didn't bring up yet, which is I don't think that Obama was railroaded by the military so much as all the decisions were filtered through what can we do domestically. What do domestic political advisors think about this? What will the American public support? How much is this going to cost?
And support was to get out.
How long is this going to take? And so all of these decisions were shaved in order to create that exit path. And I think that's where a strategy like this never has a chance, because if you are signaling that you're not really in it, then you're not really in it.
But as a commander-in-chief, how can you say, look, we want to leave, but it's politically untenable, so we're going to risk the lives of so many of our service personnel for the next few years?
I'm the military,
Right.
I'm the military
That's
guy
exactly
sitting here. You could put 500,000 NATO and U.S. forces in Afghanistan, stay there 20 years and spend $10 trillion, and it would look about the same it does right now, except you would have a lot of enclaves in the enemy you were fighting would be mostly in the Fatah, waiting for you still to leave, because
the
they know you're a limited war. They're not in a limited war. They're going to fight you to the death.
And as far as these training ideas, and we now have Lieutenant Colonel David Davis, who wrote a rather amazing report suggesting that the entire training program has been a failure. And actually, not only that, we've been consistently lied to by the military on these topics.
And I think, you know, training and security provided by Afghan security forces is also a military strategy, and that is important. And so you need a military component. I frankly think that that's right. You don't want the United States to be in the lead indefinitely. You don't want that scale of a military presence, but you need it to be success-based,
Rajiv,
success-driven.
What's your sense of that from talking to people within? I mean, is there? Are we being told the truth even now?
It's a mixed bag. Look, we're trying to create an army that's unsustainably large there, that's too westernized, that really isn't in keeping with Afghan norms and traditions. At the same time, the Afghans are tough fighters if they know what they're fighting for. Look at the 1980s. I mean, these guys in sandals and Kalashnikovs defeated the Soviets with only modest American support. The problem is they don't know what they're fighting for. They don't love the Karzai government. They have a mixed relationship with the Taliban. There are concerns among the ethnic Pashtuns in the south about a potential another civil war.
And again, all widely predicted at the time President Obama made the decision.
Yes,
right?
and so I mean, what you're touching on with this sort of surge to the exit question really gets to a fundamental sort of moral question here. And how do you justify the loss of all the lives and limbs of those who were surged if the path was really to exit? And if you go back to 2009, there were probably only two defensible strategies. One was a really large surge that would go on for some years on end. The results of that, I acknowledge, would be very debatable, and you probably would still be fighting after 10 years, or a much narrower counterterrorism mission. We chose the middle path, and it was a fundamentally untenable path.
Worse than that, we chose both. We chose the one with Petraeus, and then the other one with McChrystal.
At the very least,
in a certain aspect.
The civilian surge then, and still, you hear President Obama's defenders talk about women's rights and so forth, and the role of U.S. NGOs and so forth. I mean, was that a success at least?
I think the civilian surge was a total disaster. I think we had the civilians who were the civilian surge was supposed to get American diplomats and reconstruction workers down working with the military in districts and villages of Afghanistan. The civilian surge was delayed by months and months, and then most of those people wound up in the embassy compound in Kabul, the fortified compound with a swimming pool and a bar and all sorts of other things, as opposed to getting out into the field with the troops. We wound up on the reconstruction front, which is part of the civilian surge. We poured in $4 billion in 2010. It was far more money than Afghanistan could reasonably absorb. It wound up fueling the very corruption we were trying to stop.
The other tenant.
And one like we hadn't already done that in Iraq, so we had a mirror to look back at.
Right, exactly. Pakistan, of course, this relationship based on mutual interest, respect, and trust, or at least it was supposed to be recast as that. I suppose I don't need to ask you about that. Ambassador, very quickly, we've only got a few minutes left. But again, another failure of the strategy.
Well, there are several elements. Rajiv touched on a lot of these, and I'll just recap them. There was an assumption that we were going to be able to work with Pakistan. Well, that turned out not to be the case. So we have a permanent safe haven that's an issue. There was an assumption that we were going to be able to work with the Karzai government. Well, the credibility and the corruption levels in the Karzai government have become much worse over the same period of time as well. There was an assumption about the training of the security forces. That is not going to the same specifications. On the civilian surge, I think Rajiv is exactly right. Again, we didn't do the civilian surge the way we said we would. And frankly, again, I believe you need a safe environment in order for civilians to be effective. So that requires the security presence. So all of these things stacked up to create something that just didn't work.
And let me just point out one other thing to reinforce what he just said, because I was there and saw it. The civilian surge is virtually impossible given the fact that we have such an imbalance in our security budget. State and the people around state, unless you subcontract everything, really doesn't have the people to do this kind of surge.
At any point, though, I mean, was there a discussion as to whether it was the U.S. presence itself that was causing the instability there? Or is there any realization or any discussion about that as far as we can tell?
I think there's a grudging acknowledgement at senior levels that yes, that is a factor, that when troops move into these remote valleys, they create their own economy of violence, that Taliban middlemen show up with bags of cash and pay locals to fight. those people wouldn't be coming there if we weren't there. And our presence there also keeps Afghans from finding their own solutions to this. And as U.S. forces pull out, there will be, among the Afghans, their own methods of solving this. In some cases, they will fight. In other cases, they will negotiate. If we want to get to peace talks, it's going to be after we leave. The Afghans are going to have to do this themselves.
Rajiv, thank you very much. Colonel Wilkerson, thank you. Ambassador Volker, thank you for that assessment of President Obama's major foreign policy of his first term.